For the past couple of weeks, I have been slowly reading Garrison Keillor's memoir, That Time of the Year. It's the type of book that I savor a chapter or two each night before bed. Keillor often gives praise for those that have helped him and have encouraged him along the way. It's a good habit for all of us to be in. And there's a long litany of such folks, such as his mother and aunts and teachers and even some of the preachers in the Separatist Brethren Church of his youth. But I like what he said about one of his high school drama coaches. And he writes, "Miss Person gave me encouragement when I was desperate for a boy with bad hair and wearing girls' clothes. Her gift was to help self-conscious youngsters step out of the bubble. It's not about you. It's about the material. Work on the material. Don't make the performance be about you. Let yourself be a vehicle for something greater than yourself." I like that. Let yourself be a vehicle for something greater than yourself. It's good advice. And isn't that the lesson that we receive from all of these examples of faith that we find in the 11th chapter of Hebrews? Those who dare to trust and to follow God all become a vehicle for something that is greater than themselves. Abraham and Sarah weren't just an old couple. They gave the world an insight into the covenant relationship that we can enjoy with God. Now today, as we look at the end of Hebrews, we're going to learn about Moses and others, all who are vehicles for something greater. And may we also strive to be that kind of a vehicle. The passage starts in the 11th chapter, beginning with the 23rd verse and reading through the end. So listen now for God to speak to us through His Word. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for Christ to be greater wealth than all the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if they were on dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I remember a bumper sticker back sometime in the mid-'80s that read, "The one who dies with the most wins." Later in that decade, the movie Wall Street came out. It was to be a movie that showed the dangers of excess, but it ended up turning out that the movie's villain was well liked, and many people wanted to follow him, even though he made in a speech this statement, "Greed, for the lack of a better word, is good." And that statement generally got shortened down to just "greed is good." None of this expresses a Christian truth. In fact, the Christian truth is just the opposite. As Christians, our goal can never just be to achieve as much as possible in this life. And there are two reasons that cannot be our goal. First, we know that everything that we have, everything that we own, all that is in this earth doesn't belong to us. It belongs first and foremost to God. And second, we of all people know that God has something better in store for us. Therefore, we are to make decisions in our lives that are based on such knowledge. Today, as we continue through this lengthy list of heroes of the faith that we find in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, and we're starting with Moses. But the author here doesn't just point out to Moses' faith. In fact, the author goes back before Moses to his parents, his family, who risked their lives to go against the order of Pharaoh and to save their firstborn boy. And they did this even though that meant letting him go and allowing him to be claimed by Pharaoh's sister. Today's Mother's Day, and we can only imagine the pain of Moses' mother and the pain that she felt in her heart as she watched her son float down the Nile in a basket that gave him a chance at life. Think of the faith that required. And then there's Moses himself. He chose the hard path. He was willing to stand up for those who were slaves, those who had no standing, those who were expendable. This didn't help him, at least not financially. I mean, he had to abandon the wealth that he enjoyed there in Egypt and spend the rest of his life living in a tent. Came back to Egypt after having been away. He led the Hebrew people out of bondage, but he wasn't very well liked when he came back. A lot of the Egyptians certainly didn't like him. But think of his sacrifice. Think of what he gave up. And he gave it up. Why? Because he had faith in God. He knew God was doing something greater. And think of the risk of those in positions of power and prestige. Risk when they stand up for what they believe is the truth. Or when or when they do something in the hope that others can obtain justice. True faith is seen in the one who places God first in their lives, God above all else. Now, for those of you who have gotten to know me, know that I read 3 or 4 books at a time. They're always in different genre. That allows me to kind of keep the books separated in my head. One of the books that I'm always involved in, though, is an audible book. And I often listen to this when I'm either in the car or sometimes when I'm walking out in the neighborhood. I always listen to unabridged books. And currently I'm listening to a book that is by Richard Flanagan. It's titled The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And it's the story of Dorigo Evans, who's a physician within the Australian Army. And he's captured in Java early in World War II and sent to a POW camp in Thailand, where he and the rest of the POWs are assigned this task of building with bare hands the Burma Railroad. And the history of the railroad, this is a novel, but the history of that railroad is truly horrific. The author notes that some accounts put the death toll of over 200,000 people, which is the author in an interview that he did pointed out was more than the number of words that's in his 400-page book. So think about that. But when the commander of the unit dies, Dorigo finds that he is actually now the top-ranking officer. So he's the one that is now in charge of these Australian POWs, and he tries to do what he can to help those who are under his command out. And at one point, some of his men go out and they secretly kill a small cow from one of the Thai people that was nearby. And then they secretly, the cooks, they butcher it and they cut it up and they cook it for the men. And they come with him as he's their commander and they give him the choice cut. A nice, juicy steak. And he finds this steak so tempting. But he knows it would be a bad example. Because there's not enough meat to go around, even with this cow, for all of the POWs that are there. And they're all malnourished and they're all suffering. So instead of accepting this gift, he insists that the cooks take that steak to the hospital and to feed it or have it been given to those who are suffering from malnutrition. Those who have been living on soup made out of grass with a little rice. His actions did earn him praise. But as the book goes on, boy, did he want that steak. He could just taste it. And he knew that if they didn't take that thing away immediately, he was just going to devour it and it would be gone. But instead, he needed to do what was right and what was best as an example for those under his command. Doing what is right often has negative consequences. Instead of enjoying a life in the palace, Moses finds himself living the rest of his life under a tent in the wilderness. Instead of enjoying a nice slice of beef, Dorigo continues to have hunger pains. But is the right action to satisfy our bodies for just a moment of pleasure? Or is it to do what we can do to help others? Rahab is another of our characters. She might not be the biblical woman that comes to mind on Mother's Day. Interestingly, the author of Hebrews doesn't mince words. We're reminded here of what her occupation was. She was a prostitute. Interestingly, contemporary Jewish writings of the first century often avoided talking about her occupation, although you do find that if you go back into Joshua. Instead, they praised her hospitality for receiving the Hebrew spies. But we learn two things about her in this passage. First, she has heard how God has helped the people through the Exodus. And because of that, she now believes this is the real God, the God of the Hebrews. That's the God that is real. So she shows her faith there. But then she uses her knowledge to bargain to save her entire family. Her parents, her siblings, and all of their extended families benefit from her faith. Unlike many of the examples, Rahab received a promise, her promise immediately, saving her family, but she also becomes enshrined. So she has this longer fulfillment because she becomes enshrined in the Hebrew Hall of Fame. She is an ancestor of both King David and through Joseph of Jesus. How many of us have benefited from the faith of another, especially from the faith of our mothers, or in this case, the mother benefiting from the faith of her wayward daughter? Interestingly, while the book of Hebrews credits the people following Moses with faith as they cross the sea and as the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, he doesn't mention Joshua. If you remember, Joshua is the one that took over after Moses, and he was the one that actually led them to conquer the promised land. Now, this oversight may have been intentional because Hebrews, throughout this book, does not want us to focus on an earthly promised land where the people might find rest. Instead, the focus that we're constantly being redirected toward in the book of Hebrews is our true homeland, which is a place God has in store for us. After Rahab, the preacher of Hebrews cites a litany of Old Testament heroes. It's unfortunate and the language issues that the rhetorical beauty of the litany that appears in Greek is lost in translation. I mean, this is why the judges kind of get mixed up in Hebrews. This is because the author is striving for this kind of lyrical sound that comes out. But poetry is hard to translate. There are three sets of names that are mentioned: those who accomplished through faith, those who have overcome obstacles by faith, and those who have endured suffering because of their faith. The names include 4 judges, 1 king, and an allusion to many prophets. Now, while the prophets, except for Samuel, are not named, 2 do stand out: Elijah and Elisha, both who are credited with resurrecting the sons of widows. These resurrection accounts are mentioned here, so we can think of who Hebrews is referring to. Our author winds up his litany of heroes with a list of horrific experiences that some have faced because of their faith. When we think we've been persecuted, perhaps we should review this list. From mockings and floggings to being stoned and sawing, while others flee in the desert and the mountains, people of faith have endured much. Yet, we're told at the end of this chapter that they did not receive their promised reward, at least not in this life. And they didn't because God has something better in store for them. At the end, as we've seen throughout Hebrews, the author hints to what is next, to Jesus, how God is bringing this fulfillment about, the one in whom we have our hope. Jesus, the perfecter of our faith, who has suffered too. And we'll look at that next week. With all these names and examples of faith, the preacher of Hebrews wants us to be ready to run the race. But until then, think about what we might do if we trust God and if we are willing to step out of our comfort zones. What might God do through us? Our lives are never just about ourselves. As people of faith, we are to be about God and about what God can do through us. Amen.